Thank you all for welcoming me into your community. Very deeply honored, this privilege. Oh, here's a problem. My bifocals only go so far, so I have to hold up a little bit. I have been working around the world on drug issues since 1998, which was the last time the United Nations had their UNGAS. And so in many ways we've come full circle. Back in 1998, the agreement from the UN was that we would have a drug-free world in 10 years. We haven't met the deadline. And we are looking now at re-examining the target and the premise of these things. So we're here at a particularly important moment internationally. I have, in my work, traveled lots of fancy cities, Vienna, Bogota, Ottawa, Washington, but that's not, those are pretty boring places, in my opinion. What I've really enjoyed the most is meeting with communities, both peasant farmers and indigenous communities around the world, to look at the impacts of the war on drugs on their communities. You know, I've been in welcoming ceremonies from the Andes to the Amazon to Native Americans to First Nations in Canada, and nothing quite as impressive as what I went through this morning. So it's a real treat, a real honor. Thank you. But I also, you know, work with some of these communities on the intersection of the war on drugs. Some of them are being deeply affected by drug cultivation moving into their communities. They're being pushed out of their ancestral lands. Some are being persecuted for their drug use, but what the West considers drug use, these are traditional plants that have been used without abuse for thousands of years. They use a model of sacred control rather than criminal justice control. So there are different ways to control these substances. And some of these substances are quite powerful. We still don't understand, modern chemists don't understand how some of these tribes in the Amazon, for instance, are able to manufacture these things from simple ingredients in the jungle, doing some very advanced chemistry. But they also use it as medicine, and that's very important, because if we all go back, particularly those who are westernized, if you go back, you know, 4, 5, 6 generations, you didn't have pharmacies, you didn't go to the drugstore for your medicine, right? Your ancestors went to your gardens, they went to the forest, they went to the jungles to get their medicines. If you go to a traditional doctor today in China or India or any of the ancient cultures, very often the first thing they'll tell you to do is change your diet before they prescribe any kind of drug at all, if they even do that. Because they understood that there's an arbitrary distinction, a Western conceit, that we made a division, a false division between food and medicine. All foods have properties. Some of them are medicinal properties, some are weak, some are quite strong, and some have psychoactive properties. But many communities around the world have found different ways to engage with those substances in sustainable ways. I've also worked on the demand side of drug consumption in the United States. When I first began in 1998, I worked in a place called East Baltimore. If you've ever seen the movie, the TV series The Wire, it's set in that community. So very tough, urban, plagued by violence communities, a lot of poverty, despair, and alienation. And in many ways, I see not just our drug problem, but our criminal justice problem, delinquency, terrorism, are rooted in core issues having to do with poverty, despair, and alienation. I call it the PDA problem. Right? The poverty is the one everyone can point to, it's easy to see, but despair and alienation cut across class lines in very profound ways. And I want to scratch the surface of that in a little bit. But, so I've worked on the demand side. I've also worked on the supply side, many years working on trying to stop this thing called Plan Colombia, which is a $10 billion program where the United States funded spray planes that deforested over 4 million acres of a very sensitive biodiverse region of Colombia, trying to destroy the coca plants before they be turned into cocaine and smuggled out of the country. And I'm not going to get into photos or anything, but the devastation has been just unimaginable. Brown as far as the eye can see. Many of these are indigenous lands, some of it colonized by campesinos or peasant farmers that have been pushed out of their lands after 5 decades of civil war in Colombia. But the destruction there and the destruction in places in the United States on the consuming end of things, again, you see the linkage between their conditions. It's poverty, despair, and alienation on the production side, incredible poverty, and abandonment by the state. That's why these farmers engage in these activities, not because they're bad people, it's because that's the only economic choice that they have. And then the people on the receiving end, the consumption end of things. And I think if we targeted, I mean, it's easy to say, but if we targeted our efforts at problems, at the root problems of poverty, despair, and alienation, I think we solve a whole host of social ills along with that. Now, it's easy to say, how do we even begin to do that? Well, we can stop by doing bad things, things that we should learn from mistakes. Right? In the United States, in my lifetime, I'm on the wrong side of 50 now, we have spent more than $1.5 trillion trying to fight this war on drugs in today's dollars. Right? And the drugs, unfortunately, are winning. That is to say, if you look at the government's own indicators of success or failure, they measure the price, the purity, and availability of drugs. Prices are as low as ever, they're as pure as ever, and they're as easy to obtain as ever. So we're at record rates or near record rates of failure. And part of that reason, I think, is because the seeds of failure are baked into the equation. Because we've done something that sounds very good. If drugs are bad, why not have a war on drugs? Unfortunately, the solutions to many of these problems are counterintuitive. People know what counterintuitive means? This is my lobbying problem in Congress, right? This is what I show people. This is an example of a counterintuitive problem. You've seen these Chinese finger traps or Mexican finger cuffs, right? And you get stuck in these things. And the natural response to get yourself out is to pull. But the harder you pull, the stucker you get. Right? It's counterintuitive to think, well, maybe you relax a little bit, maybe you can push in a little bit, and that's how you can extricate yourself from the situation. And so many of the solutions to the war on drugs, to the drugs problem, are counterintuitive. They can even sound frightening at times. But bear with me for a moment, and I'll try to walk you through some examples. We have tried very hard to attack drug traffickers in our country. We've locked up, we have the largest prison population on planet Earth, more than any other country, more than Russia, more than China, both in absolute numbers and per capita. So it's become our badge of international shame. Most of that is due to the war on drugs. We've sentenced people to very long sentences, and we've accomplished very little as a result of that. We've destroyed a lot of communities. We didn't practice restorative justice. It was just purely punitive. And now the pendulum is swinging backwards. Even our conservative politicians are realizing we have gone too far. This is not the right way to go. But there are many ways in which this plays out. By attacking, for instance, drug traffickers and over-applying, and I support law enforcement. I just don't think that the way it's applied bureaucratically in the United States is working. That is to say, they try to go after all of these drug traffickers in the same manner. And if you do this decade after decade, the drug economy tends to evolve under Darwinian principles, right? Selection of the fittest. The people we typically capture tend to be the people who are dumb enough to get caught. They're the ones who've made mistakes. They broke their operational security. They stayed on the cell phone too long. They spent their money in too flashy ways. They got involved in turf wars. They did all these things that raised their profile, and they got caught. So we're picking out the inefficient traffickers. Conversely, the people we tend to miss year after year tend to be the ones who are the most adaptable, the most sophisticated, the most innovative. And so in that Darwinian sense, we've had a policy of artificial selection. We've been selectively breeding, if you will, for super drug traffickers, right? Highly evolved syndicates. And this economy has evolved at a lightning pace, much faster than it would otherwise. And I think it's a very tragic and indeed a dangerous thing to offer an X prize, if you will, to drug traffickers. If you don't know what an X prize is, some billionaire puts up I'll give $1 million to whoever can go to the first, transatlantic solar plane flight or whatever objective. We've done that with drug traffickers. So we've tried many ways of stopping drugs at our borders. We've tried, for instance, you've heard Donald Trump talk about the wall. Let's finish the wall, build the wall. We've built large sections of wall. One of the first things the traffickers did was build ramps, metal ramps in a big truck. They pull up and they drive over the wall. Then they went backwards 2,000 years and used Roman technology, catapults. They literally flung packages of drugs over the wall. They picked up by accomplice on the other side. The wall in many places has these 4-inch gaps that allow small wildlife and seeds and things to pass through, but not people. And the traffickers quickly adapted. Their packages became 3 3/4 inches wide, and they would pass them through. And so we found countermeasures to all these things. And it didn't take long for them to adapt to our countermeasures. So now they used to use small planes, right? Then it got so profitable they could buy an old airliner, jetliner, on its last legs and crash it on the other side and still have a profit at the end of it because they could move much greater quantities. When we got better radar and we started intercepting these flights, they switched to ultralight aircraft, right? Small little planes with a lawnmower type engine and a drop cage. They can hold several hundred pounds of drugs, and they fly over the border, pull the lever, it drops, and their accomplices pick it up. And now, because we're going after, we've been identifying some of these ultralights, they're now using drone technologies, right? There's no person to capture, no one to snitch or inform on them. So we force this evolution on the border. And even if we do find a way to stop these drones, I think the most serious threat we faced are narco tunnels. So we discovered over more than 100 very sophisticated tunnels beneath the US-Mexican border. And there are probably hundreds more that are undiscovered. And these are very troubling because they are very advanced. You've heard of El Chapo Guzman, the Mexican drug lord who escaped via a tunnel, right? These people are very good at building tunnels. And some of these tunnels are very sophisticated. They have ventilation systems, rail tracks, electric rails. And they can move tons of drugs and cash and guns and weapons in both directions, and people. And so this, from a national security point of view, I think is one of the most threatening things because there's no incentive to do it right now, but if one of the drug cartel's lieutenants were corrupt enough to be bribed by, say, ISIS or some other terrorist group to smuggle WMD or terrorists through, they could easily do that in those tunnels as well. When they broke up one of the big tunnels in 2012 in Tijuana, Mexico, right across from San Diego, they found, it was just about to open, and they found 40 tons of marijuana on the Mexican side ready to go through. So that's the kind of volume you can picture going through. And also, they've tried stopping it on the high seas. In the old days, they would use fishing boats, shrimp boats, and try to smuggle drugs that way. We started interdicting those. They started using speedboats. They could outrun anything that the Coast Guard had. And the Coast Guard got faster boats. And then the drug cartels developed semi-submersible submarines. They're 90% underwater. They have a little conning tower for air and navigation. During the day, they pull a blue tarp over themselves and lie still, and you can't spot them in the water. And they travel at night. And they can move 6 to 10 tons per shipment. Right? Very hard to detect. But we got better at detecting those. And so now they have actually built, and they have a number of these, proper submarines that can dive 50 feet below the water. So this is getting a very dangerous cat and mouse game. We're ending up with more evolved traffickers with higher stakes and creating more danger from a national security point of view, in my opinion. And so that's the Darwinian problem, right? You end up with highly evolved traffickers. We also tried, some people say, well, don't go after the little fish because you end up with super traffickers. Go after the big cartels instead, right? Go after the big fish. We've done that for decades. You might have heard of the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel. These were the two dreaded gigantic cocaine cartels that ruled the global cocaine trade in the 1980s and 90s. We spent a lot of effort and worked with a lot of brave Colombian police and soldiers to break them up. And you think, wow, these were the 900-pound gorillas. We got rid of them. That should have solved the problem. That should have at least put a big dent in the problem. No. It got so bad that we had to then respond with a $10 billion program called Plan Colombia. Because what happened was, we took out the two big monopolies. And we opened up this incredibly lucrative economic space to literally hundreds of smaller operations, some of them family-owned, so they're called very often family cartels or boutique cartels. They have their own smuggling routes, their own list of officials they bribe. We can't even count the number of smaller operations that have taken over, much less try to infiltrate and disrupt them. Because that's the problem with going after the big fish. You end up democratizing this economy. And the problem is that neither approach looks at why these people continue to traffic drugs over and over again, right? It's not because they're evildoers, and they're evildoers, but it's not because they want to be evil that they're doing this. They're doing it because that's where the money is. Because as I mentioned earlier, the seeds of the failure are baked into the policy of prohibition. That is to say, we've taken what are essentially minimally processed agricultural commodities and made them priceless. So priceless that people are willing to kill and slaughter and do unspeakable things to traffic these drugs. When we talk about things like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, even methamphetamines, these are things that are very easy to produce. Right? They should cost pennies per dose to produce. In fact, if you want to go on the internet and search for a film called Shoveling Water, it's a little 20-minute video I did in the jungles of Colombia. I spent a day with peasant farmers looking at why they grow coca, how they process it, and what their realities are, to see it from their point of view. I lost my train, sorry. So we've tried attacking this and basically escalating the price of these substances, right? Think of it this way, drug prohibition provides an unintended or indirect price support for drug traffickers. Without the risk of the war on drugs, these people have very little risk premium they can charge the next person down the smuggling chain. And if you removed all penalties altogether, they'd be out of business because they'd be moving minimally processed agricultural vegetable matter, minimally processed, basically. This is a very powerful incentive. I don't want to belittle this and ridicule it as just a plant, but put it this way, you can buy a kilo of pure cocaine in the streets of Medellin, Colombia for about $1,500 US. The price will fluctuate a little bit from time to time, but basically it's like $1,500. By the time you smuggled that and got into the streets of New York City or Washington or Baltimore, and by the time the dealers cut it and dilute it with whatever garbage they're going to stretch their profits with, and they sell these little gram bags, you can get approximately $150,000 for that exact same kilogram. Nothing has happened to cocaine, right? What users are paying for are transportation costs, or rather the risks associated with transportation. And so that the more we escalate the war on drugs, the more valuable the drugs become. Each time the drugs cross a border, particularly if it's a highly policed border, the greater the risk to drug traffickers, that is to say that the greater the likelihood they'll get caught or the longer, the tougher sentence they might have to serve, then the higher the premium they can charge the next person down the smuggling chain. And so that's why the more we wage this war, the more valuable the drugs become, the more people get involved in this activity. And so it's a vicious cycle that should not be there. And when I look at all of these problems, the more I think about it, I think that the real disease that we're looking at is not so much addiction, but modernity. And I say this as a person of Chinese ancestry. Well, I thought my people revered our ancestors. I have a lot to learn from you all. But my father, about a decade ago, went back to our ancestral village in China. And he brought back a digital copy of our family scrolls, the family tree, no pun intended. And I knew it went back many generations. And it's very common for Chinese peasants even if your family's illiterate, you would pay someone who is literate to write this down for you and guard it and protect it. I had no idea how many generations it went back. It turns out it goes back, we think, 26 generations to the year in the Western calendar, 637. When I look back and I think upon their lives, the lives of my ancestors, and I don't want to romanticize it. There are definitely a lot of problems, and it's certainly not a great life to be a Chinese peasant historically, or to be a woman in Chinese peasant society. But there's something to be said for any society that can figure out how to replicate itself sustainably for more than 6 or 7 generations. Right? If you figured that out, you figure out something very important, because it's not something that we have figured out how to do yet. In terms of our post-World War II transnational capitalism, right? We don't know how sustainable the system is. And we don't have elders to tell us, to warn us. We've let down our guards. The food that I consume comes from halfway around the world. I go to my local supermarket, I bought a package of organic spinach for $1.69, and it was delicious, frozen. And I looked at the label, and it was grown in China. Somehow we lost the ability to grow spinach in the United States. And economists will tell you, well, that makes perfect sense. You save 10 cents on that bag of spinach. That's perfectly sensible. How do you explain to your great-great-great-great-grandchildren yet unborn that we melted the glaciers, we destroyed the environment, but boy, I saved 10 cents on that bag of spinach. That made good sense. No elder would say that, right? I look at this world we live in of concrete, steel, petroleum, and silicon. And we think this is the way things were meant to be. This could only have been this way, because that's all we see. There's an old African proverb that says that the last one to recognize the existence of water is the fish, right? Because they're swimming in it. We're swimming in this modernity that we've created, and we don't realize that we've actually created this world. And we created it through a series of choices and policies that we've made, or refused to make because we abdicated the responsibilities, we privatized and deregulated and let the market decide for us. And the market doesn't care about your great-great-grandchildren. It cares about profits here and now. And I think sooner or later we have to come to this realization that we need, more than ever, the wisdom of our elders, who have been on this world longer than the rest of us, who can see around the corner and see where instability is going to come down the road. Some of the wisest people I've ever met have been elders in the Amazon, indigenous tribes. And people think, well, you know, they don't have access to technology. And kids would say, they don't have Google. What do they know? They're old. These are people who have been on this planet 7, 8 decades. In the Amazon, near the equator, sun rises and sets at 6:30 approximately every day. What do you do after 6:30 at night when the sun goes down? Instead of being distracted by all the televisions and radios and all these other things that distract us, and my stupid iPhone and things like that, they actually talk to each other. They look at social relationships within the community, and they have such a precise and fine and nuanced reading of what's going on in terms of interpersonal relationships. And they know that if you introduce this new technology or you know, allow these influences, certain influences to come in from modern Colombia, they can see trouble coming a mile away. And I have learned to respect that greatly. We also now live in a world where politicians think in 2, 4, 6-year election cycles. And once they're elected, they think about how they stay in power, how not to rock the boat, how not to make difficult choices or counterintuitive choices. But we need to look back at the elders of the Iroquois Confederation in the United States. Among other things, we borrowed our Constitution from them. They actually came up with the idea of a document to govern many different tribes. But their elders used to ask this question before they undertook a big decision. How will the decisions we adopt today affect the 7th generation down the line? That's how long they were thinking. Our politicians think in very short-term numbers. Our corporations think in terms of quarterly numbers. If you don't make your numbers that quarter, your stock will tank, you'll be taken over, and you're gone. Right? Whose job is it to look out for future generations, look out for the bigger picture? And I hope that we will take some lessons from failed policies in the past and try not to replicate them in the future. Because when we look at this world of modernity, sometimes I wonder if the amount of self-medication, particularly in Western societies, is a rational response to a world gone mad. It's a crisis of meaning, crisis of belonging. We've created a world that really doesn't make sense. And I think a lot of people get that, but it's inchoate. They don't know how to express it. It's at the tip of their tongues. They can't quite put their finger on it, but there's something not quite right about the way things are going. Right? And this is what we're seeing in the United States. There's a revolution. Whether it goes fascist or socialist is another question. But people are realizing the status quo doesn't work anymore, and they need change. To give you one more example of lifeways, one that touches me particularly, in the mid-1990s, we passed something called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I understand the TPP is quite controversial here as well. And my office worked against it. One of the arguments was that it would help Mexico develop faster. Right? They have a lot of population living in rural societies, growing corn traditional ways. Good corn, non-GMO corn, heritage-restrained corn. And the village life was unchanged for many generations, essentially. And the technocrats in Washington, and Ottawa, and Mexico City, whose feet never got dirty, whose shoes never got any mud on them, these geniuses thought, well, that's inefficient. We can grow corn in the United States at an industrial scale in the Midwest. We can export it to Mexico. That would free up their labor. to then develop their country. Higher end technologies, they can produce things in factories and whatnot. These geniuses never thought about, well, who's going to teach the children? How are they going to raise children in a fundamentally different environment? Because if you look at traditional agrarian life in Mexico, everything revolved around the agrarian planting cycle, and corn was central to that. Your ceremonies, your weddings, your songs, your rituals, your holidays, your feasts, all were deeply rooted in the land and cycles of the land. Suddenly, the technocrats tore them asunder from that land. They could no longer afford to grow corn and compete with cheap imports. And they were thrust into an urban reality of concrete, steel, petroleum, and silicon they didn't understand. They were at the bottom of an exclusionary society. You know, the story of the city mouse and the country mouse. And they were excluded. They were at the bottom. And then very often now both parents had to work in these factories, the sweatshops, the maquiladoras, right? And nobody figured out, well, what do we do about the children? How are they going to raise the next generation? What songs do they teach them? What traditions are they going to continue with? And when will they have the time to do this? They destroyed the lifeways that kept societies stable for many generations. And today, I think we see some of the results of that dislocation. And it's been incredibly violent. Because when you're at the bottom of exclusionary society and you really don't have a future, you become prey to gangs, to narcos, who can offer you instantly status through a gun, social mobility through money, and respect, even as through intimidation. And so there's an inexhaustible reservoir of young, alienated Mexican men and women who would rather live as a king for a year, a short life, than as a pauper for a lifetime. And that is a very dangerous formula. More than 100,000 people have died in the past decade in this drug war in Mexico. And after attacking all these cartels, nobody believes that we've solved the drug problem. At the end of this, 100,000 dead, more than 100,000 now, the same amount of drugs are going to flow from Mexico to the United States, right? The same amount. No one has a problem getting drugs in the United States, and it's coming through Mexico. The only thing that's different, you'll have slightly different turf lines. The various cartels will carve up different turf, and they'll reach a new equilibrium, and they'll go back to the quiet business of trafficking drugs. So no one believes this is going to stop the drugs. So to what end have we done this? This has been a very expensive thing in terms of money, but especially in lives. Right? And it's going to take a long time to heal those kinds of wounds. And when it comes to drug policy, I think, again, it's counterintuitive. When I worked in East Baltimore, the conditions were so grim. These communities were literally on the front lines of a literal war on drugs. And there was very little hope in these communities. They had no jobs in these communities, no access to job training programs, no transportation infrastructure that would take them to the suburbs where there were jobs. The only economic activities were illicit ones, drugs and prostitution. And for many of these people, they genuinely believed that tomorrow would not be a better day. And in that situation of poverty, despair, and alienation, people turn to illicit economies to sustain themselves, but also to self-medicate very often. And our politicians, unfortunately, this is during the tough period of the 90s and 2000s, said, I see your problem. You have drugs in your community. You need to be sober and have no job and no hope and no future and no opportunity. This is not an acceptable substitute. There is no substitute at the end of the day for building a healthy society and creating healthy individuals. And so when you look at the drug problem, I work at a progressive think tank. We work on many different social justice issues, tax structures, global warming, peace, conflict, and I work on drug policy, but it fits into a larger agenda of progressive social change, that you can't do this in isolation. You can't just liberalize drug laws without fixing the deep wounds in our societies. And so that's why I do this with such passion, because it fits into everything else that we're doing to build a better world, a more sustainable world. And I'll leave you with two final examples of counterintuitive thinking. One of them comes from a psychologist named Bruce Alexander, Canadian, who did a famous study called the rat park experiment. You've all probably heard about laboratory studies that show that drugs are fiercely addictive, that if you give a rat a water bottle filled with cocaine or heroin and another water bottle just water, they'll go for the drugs every time and then do it to the point of until they die, right? That's just common sense. Everyone knows that, right? Well, Bruce Alexander thought, wait, hold on. What if I were a rat? What would I want? Would I be locked in a cage with nothing but 2 water bottles? I'd lose my mind if that were the case. And so he actually constructed a rat park. He built a healthy rat society. You know, what would I want if I were a rat? I want places to run around, places to have a little romance, places to explore, things to do, get a little exercise, and he placed those same bottles. And guess what? The rats rejected the drugs. Now, rats are rats, but what about humans? There's an interesting experiment with heroin. We had a very serious heroin problem during the Vietnam War. We had a lot of US soldiers who were thrust into a war they didn't understand. They didn't know who friend or foe was. They couldn't speak the language. They were terrified and frustrated, but they were drafted. They were stuck there. And a lot of them turned to drugs, especially heroin. Some of it provided by the CIA, ironically, because they were funding a different war in Laos, using that money. And so President Nixon was worried about the return of these veterans. They would come back to our society fiercely addicted to heroin. He did 2 things. One, I'll say this nice thing about Richard Nixon, the only thing nice I'll say about him. He actually funded drug prevention over incarceration, over law enforcement. And so his treatment was readily available for a lot of these returning soldiers. And that was a very good thing. In my opinion, the first dollar ought to go to prevention and treatment and education. But the other thing is, when these soldiers came back, most of them didn't have a heroin addiction. They gave it up. Why? We were always taught that they would be fiercely addicted for life. It would be a very difficult habit to kick. And that had to do with the fact that they were in a situation that made no sense to them in Vietnam. And when they came home to something they were familiar with, they had a reason to look forward to tomorrow, a life to get on with, a family to go back to, they became much healthier human beings in general. And I think that's how we ought to look at these things. It's sad, it's tragic whenever, and I've lost friends myself to drug overdoses and such, and had their lives destroyed, but let's understand that there are also mental illnesses underlying these things, and not to conflate the substance with the underlying conditions, and address the whole of the human rather than the substance that they put in their bodies, because people react to drugs in very different ways. Some people have no problems if they do it recreational. Other people become very addicted and have severe problems. And so those of you who are drug-free, I would ask that if I offered you a syringe filled with heroin or several lines of cocaine, would you consume it? And if your answer is no, ask yourself why not. And ask yourself, why is it that others that you know might do it? And look at some of the conditions in their lives, because it's not so much the drugs, it's about the human, it's about the person. And so I leave you on that note, and I thank you for letting me speak before you, and I hope to learn from your stories. Thank you.